Alright, hello to anyone watching this. I'm going to do a short-ish tutorial. Anyone who knows me probably knows that I ramble, so short can be anywhere up to 10-15 minutes for this. I'm just going to go over my knowledge of lighting in general, nothing specific towards gameplay or level design focus. I'm not going to talk about how to guide players or anything like that. It's just specifically about lights themselves. So to start off, on screen you can see the three light entities. One of them is the ambient, the other is spot, and the other is point. So everything you're going to hear is personal opinion and some basic performance information that I'm not necessarily 100% factual on. It's just my perception of how things work. So take what I say as an opinion, and as with all opinions, it has certain biases, and it's not infallible. There is always the chance that what I'm saying isn't right. So first up, ambient lights. Ambient lights project what is essentially a flat light on any direction. You can see when looking at it, the gradient is almost non-existent. There is a gradient, but it's very, very minor, and you can see the lines here. They make up the gradient. But for the most part, it is just a flat light. It's also quite dull and dim. Even with intensity 5, all three of these light assets are in intensity 5. Point lights are much brighter than ambient lights. I guessed that it's approximately 10 times, because if I select this ambient light now and increase it to 50, it is approximately the same brightness as the point light. And spotlights. So performance wise, from what I've gathered, 10 ambient lights is the equivalent of one spotlight of performance cost. And then because point lights are made up of spotlights, and 6 of them, a point light takes up the performance cost of 6 spotlights. Now, ambient lights, you can't do anything like shadows or specularity, but what you can do is decide different colours for different directions. This allows you to, if you're wanting the ceiling of an area to feel warmer than the ground, you could add a warmer colour hint to your room and just have the up direction coloured in a low intensity of orange, for instance, to make it feel warmer, or like a cyan blue to make it feel colder. I use this quite a lot on Unearthed. I had a lot of rooms that were fully lit, and then I just do ambient lights to make it feel a little bit colder by adding a hint of blue to everything. Spotlights, you have specular and shadows, and obviously you also have the option of atmospheric density. So the way these work is your specular makes things that are shiny shine, so you don't necessarily need to use refraction probes. You can just use a spotlight to create that specularity. Shadows, I think everyone knows what shadows are. The shadow fade rate, however, the lower it is, the further away you can see the shadows from. But as with all things, the further away you can see the shadows from, the more performance heavy those shadows become, because you can see them from further away. So you've potentially got more on screen than you would normally have had. Atmospheric density is this thickness to the light. The higher it is, the more dense and potentially blinding it can get. And the lower is the thinner it is, to the point where you can get negativity, which I don't think this displays in game anymore. I think people used to use it to cancel out conal lights in skyboxes, but I don't think it actually does anything anymore with negative lights. The outer angle, be careful when playing with outer and inner angles, because they interact with things like your cone of atmospherics will be altered. You can see it altering as I'm playing now. It will change how that appears, and then the outer angle will alter the way your shadows appear. The outer angle doesn't just affect shadows, obviously. It just makes it look lower quality. So if you've got something that's got 65 outer angle and a 30 inner angle, when you have a shadow displayed through it, it's going to become pixelated and lower resolution. But it does the same for the atmospheric beams that are going through. Like if you've got a grating that you're using to cast shadows through, it will make the ambient light going through that grate look messier. And the same is true with the max distance. If you pull the max distance to something extreme, it makes the shadows and the atmospherics look worse and worse the further out it gets. So it's worth keeping that kind of thing in mind when you're using them. I personally like using low ambient density and high intensity. So I would normally use something like 0.02 on an ambient light and then an intensity of 32, which means you can still see that you've got ambience there, but it's not as thick, it's not as obstructive to your view, it's not as obnoxious to look at. But ambience is multiplicative, meaning if you have multiple lights with ambience back to back, to back to back to back to back, in game, when you look at those through it, the ambience gets thicker, and you can see it multiplying there. So again, it's worth noting that you want to be careful with ambience because people will turn it off in game more often than not. But for those that aren't turning it off, you don't want your room to just become a hazy mess. And onto point lights. These can cast shadows, though I would never recommend turning that on. I don't know of any reason to ever have shadows on a point light because the performance cost is huge. However, having a relatively high distance on your light, low intensity, and turning specularity on will, in most places, in grey box it's going to look bad, but when it's textured and propped, this kind of light will add a sheen to a lot of things in your room, making them look shiny, looking like the light's reflecting off them in a more natural way. So that's kind of useful and worth keeping an eye on. Now, in another box here, I've demonstrated a few little things that I just want to talk around. These are mainly techniques that I use in levels. So first up, you've got the gratings here. All three of these grates are exactly the same, but I did tinker slightly with the way that I'm projecting light through them. So the further away from the grating you get, the more clean this is going to come through, but only to a certain extent. So if you push this right up close, you can see that the grating here is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So you can create interesting looking shadows that fit exactly what you want by altering how far away the spotlight is from the grating. This is an example here. If I turn the atmospherics up to 0.5, you can see, actually let's do it extreme for this situation. I wouldn't ever recommend doing this, but you can see the beams of light that come through as atmospheric. Now, if I were to increase the outer range, you can see that they become jagged. They become pixelated and lower resolution. So it doesn't look as impressive. And you can see also because my shadow, because my outer radius is larger, the shadows become less defined as well. So if I return that to 40, that looks way more in focus. This one is just demonstrating the light when it's up close, and this one was just a middle distance to show you different varieties of the same thing. If you watch this light here against this wall, you can see the difference when you have less shadow fade. So as you get further away, the shadows disappear and everything becomes bright. So it's definitely worth, and that is with a shadow rate of 0.04. If I put it back to its default, that's the distance that you're looking at. by the time the shadows just disappear. Let's say it's worth noting that some people have shadows disabled, so if you turn shadows off on this light, that's what's coming out. So something that you can do instead of putting shadows in, so that you can more appropriately light for people who don't use the shadow effect, or shadow option should I say, you can use gobo textures. Gobo or gobbo is fine, it doesn't matter which. Now, I don't really have much experience using gobo textures, so I'm not going to go in and start showing all of them off. You're welcome to explore and test things out and do whatever you like with them. They're in the main files. I will show you how where to navigate to them, if I can remember. I believe it's materials gobos. Yes, right there. So this is where all of the current gobos are in the files. So when you bring up the gobo thing, just go to materials, then gobos, and go there. You'll be able to find all different types of shadow casts. Just remember, when using a gobo, turn your shadows off. You don't really want atmospherics on it, because it doesn't show atmospherics properly in that situation. It's just a cone of atmospherics, because the texture isn't actually a physical barrier preventing the atmosphere from going through. So it will just be a large cone of atmospherics, and there's going to be no detail to it. So if you use gobo textures, I would definitely recommend not using atmospherics at all on that light. Also, if you've got something that moves, such as this fan here, if you have this prop spinning, a gobo texture is going to stay still. It can't rotate with it. So those are the two situations where using shadows instead are probably a better idea than using gobo textures. If you want atmospherics and if you want moving shadows, don't use gobos. Okay, this is completely unplanned, so I don't know what order I'm doing this in or anything, but one of the things I do see a lot of people doing is lighting lights in ways that don't look natural. And this is a bit of advice I give to almost everyone, is learn to play with the types of entities you've got and the options that they've got in them, because you can create interesting effects. Now, almost everyone uses point lights on lights, and that's fine if the light looks something like this. This light, the point light doesn't look bad, it looks fine. But if you use a point light on something like this, it doesn't make sense, because you'd have shadows here. So, and this is the performance equivalent of 6 spotlights. You can make a better looking thing without using shadows, because shadows are turned off, with 2 spotlights. So it makes sense to me that you would do this instead, because it looks more realistic, and you even get that spot behind the light that would be super bright because of the light being directly against the wall texture or prop. I see this one being used a lot, where people will put a point light underneath it instead of a spotlight with outer and inner ranges set up. Again, don't use shadows, because that way you can get the light inside or just behind the prop. You will have a little dot on top of it, but most people would never notice this, and when everything else is lit up around it and you've got more props, this is almost invisible. But if it bothers you, bring this the entity further in, and well, now it's gone. But you need to make sure that shadows are turned off to get this effect. And now I need to stop displaying other people's Twitch channels. I've just realised that I'm trying to control things on my obs instead of in the editor. So yeah, this light, you can see that I've got an outer angle of 65 and an inner angle of 60. And what that does is it creates this nice little gradient, almost line of a lighter version of the light and a brighter version, a dimmer and a lighter version of the light. It's just got a nice cast to it that I think fits this model better. And I've done a similar thing over here, only with a 75 outer and a 50 inner angle, and you can see that the inner angle, you can see the streak of light going down here. and it's just a more interesting look to have the angles displayed slightly differently. It is very small, almost insignificant detail, but like with this, if I drop this angle down to 20, you can see that the gradient is altered, and it just looks different. So experiment with lights, experiment with what they can do and what you want to do with them, and you'll be surprised at how much you can get out of them, especially considering we've only got three types of light. And I think I set this one up over here just to demonstrate that you can technically light using nothing but a spotlight and an ambient light and have something that looks relatively decent. Because I don't think this light here, which is supposed to be indented into a frame, you can see kind of what I'm talking about here, it's slightly indented. The light wouldn't hit the wall behind it, but the refraction of light off other surfaces would. Now the amount of people who will just throw a point light down on that like this and think it looks fine is crazy to me. You can make it look better, just put a little bit more time into it, and this will perform better than that point light. So if you're ever worried about performance or making your areas look more interesting, lighting is definitely the way to do it. I would personally say that when building a level in NS2, lighting is probably 60% of the work, because a lot of the areas I've built in Unearthed, they look really bad when they're not lit, and then you light them and they don't look bad anymore. Like, a lot of people say that it looks fantastic. I don't necessarily agree with that, but it's my own work, and most people don't like their own work. Okay, so moving on to different types of spotlights going downwards. So I've already shown you that there's a shadow of the fan here. When you're lighting the fan, you can do this with a ambient aura spotlight, ambient aura point light, depending on what effect you're wanting. I've used the point light here just because it's quicker and easier to just place the point light and then move on. But if I wanted, if these fans were clean, for instance, I could use a point light specifically so that you can get the specular light in there to make the blade shine and that kind of thing. You can see the difference between specular and non-specular. It's already noticeable, and that's with dirty props. With an ambient light, it's more a case of just making it so that this isn't completely black, because without a light at all, it is just solid darkness, and that wouldn't happen in a room that's got any lighting. If there's any light at all, there'll be refracted light and reflected light. So you need to light up the bottom of the fan as well as the top. This kind of light prop, I generally do just a standard spotlight. You can have shadow casts if there's things that are interesting for it. If not, don't bother with them. Same for specular. Specular performance cost is very, very much negligible. You can use specular a lot and it won't be noticeable on your performance, in my experience. And generally spotlights and specular lights aren't used enough, in my opinion, because it does genuinely make rooms look much more beautiful than they do without it. So experiment. But here, the way I lit in Unearthed, initially I did it in a much more extreme way than this that killed performance. But you have the spotlight next to the light itself to create a silhouette on the floor. The silhouette on the floor is important. You need the outer angle to be around about the same level as the floor, maybe a little bit deeper. Again, this is all personal preference, but this is, in my experience, the way to make it look better. Now, if you do that and use a high intensity light, everything around it is going to look. It's going to make the silhouette of the spotlight stand out. It'll make it look better. It'll look prettier. And to highlight it, don't use a bloom light. The game already has bloom. The props already have emission. You don't need a bloom light. Bloom lights are the ones that are really close with a really high intensity. If you do that and a player is using bloom in game, when they get near your lights, they'll be blinded because their player model will be practically white. So it's completely unnecessary. Don't do it. It's just a performance cost and an annoyance for certain players. This technique is, in my opinion, again, just better in general. Bring the light further away, reduce the intensity down from whatever ludicrously high number you had, and increase the max distance. And that way you get a nice little bit of reflected light around it, and anyone flying near it will make them feel like they're actually flying near a light without being completely blinded. And this third light underneath is the largest with the lowest intensity. And the reason you're doing that is to act like the reflected light. You could use an ambient light for this as well, but I personally use point lights specifically for the specular option. If you want to use specular, it's there. And point lights are just easier to use because you're not having to select 6 colours for every light that you're going to do. It's just one. When they make it so that when you can select the top option in the ambient light, this here, colour, when you can change that and it changes all directions, I'll start using that entity far more often, because it does the same job as a lot of my point lights. But it's just quicker to use the point lights because you only have to use one box colour. But yeah, this third one, large radius, low intensity, and that just fills out the area and makes it so that anyone just floating around this space, if there's no props and no textures, you still need light in this area. Otherwise, when aliens or marines are running through, they have no brightness to their gun or to their mouth or their rending claws, anything like that. There's a few custom maps in the past that have done really low intensity spotlights that only go about halfway down, and then there's nothing underneath, and when a skulk's running along the floor, they've basically got a black model, because even though it looks, because of the silhouettes on here and ambient lights just paint the walls and things, they don't really touch models very well. Again, I'm not 100% sure if they do, but in my experience, using these spotlights just make it feel more natural when you're in the rooms. This setup here is almost the same, only again, wide angle, low intensity, spotlight with the thing going through the floor or up to the floor. But because it's not a flat light, you don't want that circle on the floor. On the ceiling. This circle that would come from the refraction around the light wouldn't happen because this is facing the wrong way. So instead I've got a spotlight pointing up. No ambience or anything like that on it. And I made it so that it just reaches the whole thing. Now if I delete that, you'll notice that the brightness of the light is gone. Oh. Now obviously this light is going to light itself up inside. So that's what this is doing. These light props should be lighting themselves. If you don't have bloom on, this is useful. And it's not such an intense light that when you fly near it, it's going to blind you. But yeah, these are just a few techniques and a few ideas of the kind of things that you can throw together with the three light entities that we've got available. I hope this helped. I intend to potentially do a lighting for gameplay, for potentially for grey boxes, or lighting for guidance so that people can understand how to guide people's eye lines with lighting, general room detail lighting and things like that using some of these techniques. Let me know via Discord if you want specific topics of lighting or detailing discussed, or if you actually like these tutorials and such. Give me a sub, a like, etc. All that gibberish that the YouTubers say. I'm not particularly bothered. I'm not trying to become a YouTuber, but if you want more tutorials similar to this, whether it be about detailing, lighting, grey boxing or anything, I'm willing to do them, so just let me know, and thanks for watching.